quiet morning on January 30th, 1968 was interrupted by gunfire and explosions which rocked the peaceful scene as the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces broke an unofficial truce on the day of the Lunar New Year. Tet Wen Dan, often referred to simply as Tet, which had been a day of peace during the war for years, leading the South Vietnamese to allow the majority of their troops to go home and visit their families, a mistake that would cost many of them their own lives. The attacks on January 30th were actually just the beginning. The plan was actually to launch them January 31st, the actual new year. However, Communist North Vietnamese and Viet Cong had the wrong calendar, and so some of them launched their attack early. Kind of embarrassing, right? Though caught somewhat unprepared by this attack, the US still had some defenses in place. They'd been expecting some sort of attack for a while now, based off the radio traffic around Saigon and some of the other major cities. However, many of the US generals, including General Westmoreland, the general in charge of the war in Vietnam, the main thrust would be from the border regions in the north, versus what happened next, which was all of Vietnam. With much of the element of surprise gone, the rest of the attack on January 31st began. From the top of South Vietnam all the way down to the very bottom, more than 100 attacks went off, bridges blown, cities burned, and civilians rounded up by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese and executed, buried in mass graves because they believed that they were family members of service members. They might have been intellectuals, government employees, or maybe they thought that they just didn't believe in the utopian principle of communism. A massive attack occurred in Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, as well as in the historic capital of Hue, this being an ancient city surrounded by a thick wall around the old city. Another one of the main firefights happened at a fire base near the northern border known as Caisson. Man, we gotta go. We gotta go right now. Charlie's all around us. We can't let Charlie win. We gotta subscribe for more. Throughout the country, many people were traveling to go see their family for the Day of Tet, which meant many of these guerrillas and terrorists were able to sneak in to these major cities without being suspected of anything, and were able to sneak in large amount of supplies, weapons, explosives in broad daylight. Because so many people were traveling, it was easy to sneak through. The purpose of the offensive was a large yet tactical and quick-moving assault on the capital as well as some of the other government buildings to hopefully be able to incite a revolution from the inside, from the main populace, into a state of open rebellion so that the people themselves would rise up and overthrow the free government of South Vietnam, ushering in a total communist country. In Saigon, the guerrillas were backed by battle-hardened and trained NVA soldiers. NVA stands for North Vietnamese Army. These men assaulted government buildings, the ARVN base, and ARVN stands for the Army of the Republic of North Vietnam, and the radio tower, to distribute a call to arms of the people, hopefully to help them rise up and help them fight. As well as the US Embassy was also assaulted. Even days after the initial attacks, more than 50% of the ARVN forces were still in the countryside with their family, which meant this first day, the Viet Cong and NVA had a massive opportunity to take large sections of Saigon and other cities before the ARVN and the US troops were able to mass enough of a force to be able to repel them. A lot of military attacks happen around major holidays. So if you're ever in charge of anything, whether it's the military or government, just consider that. The Battle of the Bulge, the Tet Offensive, many, many more. Maybe don't let all your troops go on vacation. A few ARVN troops in allied nations, including the US and Australia, those troops fought bravely to try and push back the Viet Cong and NVA. However, they were few in number, but they did prevent a total takeover of Saigon. Attacks on government buildings were held off and the attackers were unable to take them. However, a more successful attack was on the radio tower, which they quickly took. However, a quick-thinking ARVN soldier cut the power to the radio tower, preventing them from being able to get their message out. Now, the attack on the US Embassy was much smaller. However, they were able to penetrate the main wall, and soon a small number of enemy soldiers entered the US Embassy. They were pushed back and eventually killed. However, the immediate psychological effect that it had on the American people who were watching this live on television, seeing the enemy being able to breach the US Embassy, the seat of power in Southeast Asia, was a real blow to morale. The Battle of Saigon continued for more than a month. Since the populace didn't rise up against the Americans or the Free South government, the NVA and VC slowly got pushed back into certain districts and then fully defeated, leading to an American and South Vietnamese victory. Meanwhile, in the Battle of Hue, some of the most severe fighting of the war would occur. The city had only a small American presence, and with the ARVN out on vacation, there were few people to defend the city, causing the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, which numbered nearly 10,000, to be able to take the old part of the city. The American forces and commandos of the ARVN were there to help try and push them back. However, eventually they were driven out. NVA then used the old city to their advantage because of the Americans having an oppressively strict rules of engagement. The Americans weren't allowed to destroy a lot of the old classic buildings in the city. This ancient architecture was supposed to be protected. So the communists used this to their advantage by making it so they put all their bases in these most sacred buildings. These rules of engagement were actually a really massive problem in Vietnam, from not being allowed to fire on the enemy until fired upon first, to the point where Johnson picked all the spots himself for bombing targets and then would call the North Vietnamese military to let them know that they were actually going to be firing upon them. Meaning that the Americans were expected to go house to house. Every single house, every single block had a pillbox of NVA soldiers there with machine guns ready to fight back. Without being able to use artillery, helicopters, or bombing runs from airplanes, they were sorely lacking, and it was a very slow and costly process in both lives and material. Don't let Charlie win. Subscribe for more. Eventually, because of the slow progress and the high casualty rate, the Americans did lift some of their rules of engagement, allowing for helicopters, artillery, tanks, and other aircraft to be able to be used in the attack on the city of Hue. However, the citadel of the old city and its high, strong, and thick walls meant that every single block still had to be taken. Almost the entirety of the old city was destroyed, leaving only a small remnant of what was. However, the enemy still fought in the rubble. In just over a month of fighting, the casualty rate of the Allies was over 5,000. After the battle, mass graves were found all around the city. Around 10% of their population, 6,000 civilians, had been murdered in mass killings by the communist Vietnamese, many of whom were women and children, mutilated and tortured before their deaths, sometimes burned or buried alive, simply for being Christian or Buddhist, simply for having a different belief system than the communists had, simply for having someone who might have been in the military, sometimes simply for being a teacher, or maybe they were just in the way. This massacre was just a precursor to what would eventually be the mass killings and incarceration of millions of Vietnamese following the Americans leaving South Vietnam and giving up their commitment for bullet, tank for tank protection of South Vietnam. This would lead to massive amounts of deaths, as well as millions upon millions of refugees, often referred to as the boat people, leaving South Vietnam. Meanwhile, the Battle of Caisson continued for months on end. The force of mostly U.S. Marines held back this onslaught that was near constant. They went from hill to hill around the airbase, trying to fight back. This was vicious combat on high elevations, as well as in deep, dense jungle. Nearly every day, the firebase was bombed and mortared. Even while aircraft were taking off and landing, onslaught was relentless. Eventually, the battle would end in American victory. However, the Americans would eventually decide to leave Caisson and abandon that area to the North Vietnamese. This was a constant morale hit during the Vietnam War, as well as some of our more recent ones, that after fighting so hard for a hill or an area or a city, the military would just abandon it. What was the point? They would just be like, why did I do any of that? Why did my friends die if all we were going to do was leave anyway? The Tet Offensive eventually ended in a North Vietnamese and Viet Cong defeat. With 75,000 killed and nearly double that wounded, it broke the Viet Cong, and most of the following attacks and warfare would be conducted mainly by the NVA, to the point where late in the war they were even using NVA tanks in battle. Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the Communist North, not wanting to admit that the Tet Offensive had been a complete failure, launched two more, much smaller offensives, often known as mini-Tets, later on in that year. However, they also led to failure. However, the loss of so many trained ARVN troops and material was a major gain for the NVA. It would take more than a year for the ARVN to be able to rebuild their commando structure. And the NVA gained something that they did not expect. Because of the unprecedented and uncensored press coverage of the Tet Offensive, this was a stark contrast to many previous wars, where the American people in their living room saw on their own television the brutality and horrific nature of war. Coupled that with a biased media that was heavily anti-war, this caused for the American people to really change their perspective on the war. The anti-war movement in the United States had a major boon and would continue to be a major force in the United States. Previous to this, American President Johnson had been lying to the the American people saying that the NVA were about to be defeated. However, seeing the Tet Offensive, the American people knew that this couldn't possibly be true, because if they were really just a few people in small holes out in the jungle, how could they possibly mount such a massive offensive? Then later caused President Johnson to not seek re-election. Even though NVA attacks weakened following the Tet Offensive, the anti-war sentiment exploded. President Nixon would be the next president. He would come in and rebuild the ARVN military, where many of their best troops were killed defending the South during the Tet Offensive. With the process of reducing U.S. involvement and increasing in Vietnamization worked to quiet the war, however, not the belief that the war had been lost at home. Now, if Nixon wouldn't have done the whole stupid Watergate thing, which he just blew that election out anyways, he would have been known as one of the best presidents. Why? Because he ended the Vietnam War. Scenes of brutality could not be unseen by the American public, and the trust of the American public and confidence in the military had been badly shaken. Widespread consequences continued for both sides of this war until the very end. Proven to the American people as well as everyone else that the Johnson low-grade military operation in Vietnam was not effective. Without a clear plan for victory or defeat of the North Vietnamese, there could never be victory. The psyche of the American people had forever been changed after seeing the Tet Offensive on their TV screens at home. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe. Check out these other videos. Don't let the VC win. Subscribe for more.